Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Welcome to my next video. For a long time I've been wanting to devote a video to Jalal al Dn Rumi, so this will be a video about how to get started with reading Jalal al Dn Rumi. And so, of course, it's a reading list video, although the list will be rather short. Rumi has acquired a huge, and I would say somewhat peculiar popularity in the last several decades or so. He's become hugely popular. You have people tweeting lines from Rumi, so all and sundry are reading Rumi. But who was Rumi? Jalal al Dn Muhammad al-Balkhi, son of Bahauddin Walad, that is his actual full designation, was born in Balkh. Balkh is the ancient Bactria, and the city of Balkh is situated today in modern-day Afghanistan. Jalal al Dn Rumi was born there in Balkh in the year 604 of the Hijrah. That corresponds to 1207 of the Christian calendar. He died in the year 672 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to 1273 in a city known as Konya. Konya with a qaf sound. It is in modern-day Turkey or Turkey. However, in modern Turkey, it's spelled with a K in their modern orthography, and it's pronounced as a soft. They usually don't pronounce the qaf, and they just say Konya. His father, Bahauddin Walad or Bahauddin Walad, was an extremely learned, erudite scholar of the full range of Islamic disciplines, specializing mainly in terms of his day-to-day function as a scholar of Islamic Shari'ah or sacred law. He decided to leave Balkh around the year 616, corresponding to 1219, along with his family, due to the advancing Mongol hordes who were threatening the Islamic world, and they were moving gradually towards Balkh. And so, naturally, he thought it prudent to seek his fortune elsewhere, and therefore he set out with his family, and as was the habit of many people in those days, that if they would set out on a long journey, even to relocate, they thought, well, we might as well, since we're setting out, take this chance, given that they had the necessary financial means to make the pilgrimage to Mecca to perform the Hajj. So this is what Bahauddin Walad did with his family, and of course Jalal al Dn was extremely young. On way to Hajj, they stopped off. So you have to think, I don't have a map, but you should refer to a map. Balkh is there in, I would say, northern Afghanistan. They're moving southward, obviously, and southward and westwards, right? And so naturally they would have had to have traversed, if they were going overland, what is today modern-day Iran. And indeed, they passed through the ancient city of Nishapur, where it is reported. Now this is disputed by some modern scholars and researchers, historians, but it is said in some sources that they stopped off at Nishapur, and there, again, reportedly, they met an extremely aged Fariduddin Attar. Fariduddin Attar is one of the most important poets of the Persian language, and of course, Rumi writes in Persian. So he's one of the most important Persian poets, and he is definitely a Sufi poet that immediately precedes Rumi. The other very important poet in the generation before was Hakim Sana'i, author of the famous poem Hadiqatul Haqiqa, the walled garden of reality. And of course, Fakhruddin excuse me, I must correct myself, Fariduddin Attar is the author of the famed Mantiq al-Tayr, also known as Risalat al-Tayr, typically rendered into English and known by the title of the Conference or the Parliament even of the Birds, a very beautiful allegory of the spiritual quest. Perhaps we should at some point make a video on Fariduddin Attar. But there is and so reportedly they meet Fariduddin Attar. Fariduddin Attar gives a copy of another one of his books. He wrote about 25 to 30 titles, which we can confidently say were written by him. And he presents one of these titles to the father of Jalal al Dn Rumi, namely Bahauddin Walad, his Asrar Nama, his book of secrets. And he says that your son will soon be kindling fire in all the world's lovers for God. So some people say, well, did this happen? Did it not happen? Regardless, this is what we find in some sources. Finally, after completing his sojourn, his journeys, Bahauddin Walad settles with his family in Konya, where he is received quite warmly by the Seljuk Turkish ruler and monarch Alauddin Kayqubad. Rumi's father then goes on to die in the year 628 or 1231. And as I said, he was warmly received there, and he basically carried on his profession as a cleric, a religious scholar, and much of his time, my understanding is, was spent in public preaching and exhortation, leading prayers, and the sort of things which ulama continue to do to this day. He also ran a madrasa, another common preoccupation or pursuit of the ulama down to our own times. And Jalaluddin inherited this function, this profession from his father. Now, Jalaluddin's father was himself a man of the way, a man of the path, the tariqah. He was involved in Sufism, and Jalaluddin Rumi actually took up Sufism as well from or at the hands of one of the senior disciples of his father, a man by the name of Burhanuddin at-Tirmidhi, who eventually also came and spent some time in Konya. Our sources tell us that he arrived there in 629 or 1222, and he stayed there until he died in the year 638 or 1240. So Jalaluddin learned Sufism initially from him. And it is in the year 642 of the Hijrah or 1244 that Jalaluddin Rumi first encounters the enigmatic figure of Shamsuddin Tabrizi or Tabrizi. Why the difference in the pronunciation? Well, this is a city in Iran. It's Shamsuddin of the city of Tabriz or Tabriz. The penultimate letter is either pronounced E or A, and the older classical pronunciation of Persian would be Tabriz. So people from South Asia, places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, always say Tabriz. Modern Iranian pronunciation is Tabriz. So whatever you like. I prefer Tabriz, being that I'm from Lucknow, from India originally. Anyway, so Shamsuddin Tabriz arrives there in the year 642, and this is the great turning point in the life of Jalaluddin Rumi, who had been involved in Sufism and indeed would have achieved a kind of advanced sort of status, but it was Shamsuddin of Tabriz who sort of kindled in Jalaluddin this kind of ecstatic fire for the love of God and utterly and completely transformed his life. And of course then Jalaluddin authors a number of works. Now many people are aware of his book the Masnavi, and I'm going to talk in some length about this, and there have been many translations of that, and that is what is sort of floating around. But you have to understand that Jalaluddin Rumi is a Sufi. Now Sufism is extremely misunderstood and extremely ill-represented, especially in the United States. A lot of people think that you can be a Sufi without being a Muslim. This is certainly not the case. Sufism is the inner dimension of Islam. The outer dimension may concern any number of rules and so forth. For example, how to conduct the prayer, the 5 daily prayers, the fast in Ramadan, etc. Sufism is concerned with the inner project, so to speak, the cultivation of the inner states, so to speak. And you cannot do this without being a Muslim. Anyone who tells you otherwise is just leading you down the garden path. It's simply not the case. So Sufism is a kind of advanced level of Islam, or a more advanced level of practice. There are various books on Sufism. I mean, if you don't really know anything about Sufism, you will maybe find it difficult to really understand and appreciate Rumi. But there is an effort, I think, there's almost a Rumi industry of churning out all of this stuff and saying that, well, Sufism is just, it's like Zen Buddhism or something. It's something, there's really you don't really have to be a Muslim. It's just about spirituality. I'm more spiritual than I am religious, and this kind of discourse that we find among a lot of fluffy people in the modern world. So there have been a lot of, I really cannot call them translations, just misrepresentations of Rumi. And the most notorious case of such misrepresentations of Rumi are by a man named Coleman Bark. So before we get to our actual reading list, you must avoid anything by Coleman Bark. If you actually go to his Wikipedia page, you will find that he was born on April 23rd, 1937, has taught for 3 decades or so, 30 years, literature at the University of Georgia. And he himself, with an effrontery which is utterly breathtaking, admits that he translates Rumi without speaking or knowing or reading or understanding a single word of the Persian language. Truly astonishing. Truly astonishing. That would be like me saying that, well, I can perform calculus without knowing any arithmetic or algebra. It is an utterly idiotic undertaking. So how does he, quote unquote, pull it off? You have to understand that the major sort of poetic production of Jalal al Dn Rumi that is known in the English-speaking world is the Masnavi. The word Masnavi is actually an Arabic word, Mathnawi, but in Persian the tha is pronounced as an S, and it consists of rhymed doublets. And a Masnavi production, or a Masnavi piece, does not have, a Masnavi poem, does not carry the same rhyme letter all the way through. That's why they can say these very long poems. So the word Masnavi is actually a poetic form in Persian, and that has taken on the name. It has become what the poem is known as. It's actually known as the doublets of meaning, or the Masnavi and Ma'navi. But this was first in the Western world critically edited and translated by a very eminent British Orientalist by the name of Reynold Allen Nicholson. And it was published by the Gibb Memorial Trust in the UK. So what people do is they go to a library, and you can actually still buy this, but it's pretty expensive. But they usually just obtain this book from a library. Probably now it's on PDF, but in the days that Coleman Bark was doing this, he would have gone to a library. And they get the Nicholson version, and and there's comprehensive notes and so forth, and then he just takes that and versifies it, or puts it into blank verse. Well, it's a free country in America so far, so I guess you can do this if you want, but you can't really call that translation, and you can't really call that an accurate representation of what Rumi said. So that's why I say you have to completely avoid Rumi translations by Coleman Bark. All right, if you're interested in Sufism, there are a lot of important texts on Sufism which are very sort of straightforward and can be read, and I'm going to just talk about a few of those as a kind of addition to reading Rumi. One of them is a book of Sufi aphorisms by Ibn Ata'illah. It's very small, it's very short, and it's very readable, and then you can understand what Sufism is concerned with. This is published by Brill. This edition is not so easy to obtain now. There is an easier edition to obtain, which is by Paulist Press in the Classics of Western Spirituality, and it's contained in this volume. And these volumes are known by the author. So it's Ibn Ata'illah's Book of Wisdom, and it also has something by someone named Khaja Abdullah Ansari, or the Intimate Conversations. So that's a very important book. Another very sort of straight-laced, straightforward book on Sufism is the Ar-Risalat al-Qushayriya by Abul Qasim al-Qushayri, which I have here in Arabic because I read Arabic. But fortunately, there is a translation that came out in 2020 by the Russian-American scholar of Sufism, non-Muslim, to my knowledge, named Alexander Knish. You can search that on Amazon and find it. So those are just some suggestions if you want to read about Sufism. But if you're going to get into Rumi, the best place to start, and remember this video is called Getting Started with Rumi, is this marvelous book called The Sufi Path of Love, The Spiritual Teachings of Rumi by William C. Chittick. I highly, highly encourage you to get this book. If there's only one book you read on Rumi in the English language, it should be this one, in my opinion. There is another choice you can make, and the choice is yours, and I'll talk about that book next, but one by one. So this book, The Sufi Path of Love, The Spiritual Teachings of Rumi by William C. Chittick, this is an old book, but it's still in circulation. People still read it. It's still in print. It first came out in 1983 by the State University of New York Press in Albany. And the fact that it's still in circulation so many decades later, gosh, that's almost 20, 40 years? That's a lot. I mean, it's a long time. So the fact that this book is in circulation some 4 decades later says a lot about this book. This book has the advantage that it spends not too much time on the biography, about 15 or 20 pages, and then it's divided into 3 different parts. Part 1 is the theory behind, what Rumi said. Then there's the practice, and then the part 3 is the attainment to God. So he has chapter headings like Seeing Things as They Are, Spirit, Heart, and Intellect, God and the World, Man, Prophets and Saints, Knotting the Self, Love, Separation and Union, just sort of the heart-ravishing beloved, etc. So this is a very well-done book that presents the teachings of Rumi in a marvelous way. So let's just read a few simple extracts here to give you an idea. I told you already that Rumi took up Sufism at the hand of his father's senior disciple, Burhanuddin Tirmidhi. So on page 2 here it says, after Tirmidhi's death, Rumi occupied himself mainly with preaching to and guiding the people of Konya. He gained widespread fame as one of the most respected scholars of the law, while he continued his own spiritual practices as a Sufi adept. As Sayyid Hussain Nasr has pointed out, Sayyid Hussain Nasr is Chittick's professor and mentor for many, many decades. As Nasr has pointed out, by this time Rumi was already an accomplished Sufi master. In other words, he had traversed the stations of the Sufi path and realized the direct and immediate vision of God. He discusses so constantly in his verse. But in spite of his spiritual attainments, Rumi's outward life remained the same as it had always been. So, of course, this changes when Shamsin Tabriz arrives. On page 3, Shamsin Tabriz's influence upon Rumi was decisive. For outwardly, he was transformed from a sober jurisprudent to an intoxicated celebrant of the mysteries of divine love. Then he has a quotation from one of Sayyid Hussain Nasr's articles on this. It says, it seems that, and this is Nasr speaking here, it seems that Shamsuddin was a divinely sent spiritual influence, which in a sense exteriorized Rumi's clear contemplative states in the form of poetry and set the ocean of his being into emotion, which resulted in vast waves that transformed the history of Persian literature. So there are 4 key works by Rumi. One is the Masnavi, which we've already talked about. And to give you an idea about the size of the Masnavi consists of six, excuse me, 6 parts or daftars, 6 books, we could say, of poetry. And each book ranges from between, on the shorter end, from 3,810 verses according to Chittick, and on the longer volumes to 4,915. So if we say it's about 4,000 verses per volume, give or take a few hundred, right? That's what, 16,000 verses or so. Let's say between 16 and 17,000 verses of poetry. So that's a big book. So to give you an example, I actually do not have the best Persian edition in my possession, unfortunately. What I have is an edition used in India. It's the translation, interlinear translation in Urdu by Qazi Sajjad Hussain. This is what it looks like. I think it's kind of pretty, given the fact that Urdu books are not really on very great paper or anything in India anymore. But so this is what it looks like. Each 6 books, right? So if you remove the English, the Urdu interlinear translation, it'd probably be about half that size. And so I have just a standalone volume with some smaller type published in Iran, which I couldn't find for this video. And it's about this thick, 2.5 inches thick or so. So there are, suffice it to say, there's more than one edition. And obviously, if you're going to read in English, I've already said you shouldn't read anything by Coleman Barks. So this is what I recommend. Finally getting to the point here after all of that. This is the Masnavi of Jalal al Dn Rumi in the Oxford World Classics. We can stack them all up here. Let's put them in order. Book 1, 2, 3. So you can see here. Book 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you can say, oh, well, I thought you said there were 6 books. I said, yeah, there are. So far, only 5 have come out. This is the translation by a scholar of Afghani origin by the name of Javed Mujaddidi or Jaweed Mujaddidi. And actually, they're really quite pretty. Each volume just looks very nice. I mean, they have very nice Persian miniatures on the cover. So you look at that. Very pretty. Here's book 4. Have a look at that. We're not going in any particular order here. Book 3. I think I showed book 1 first, and now I'm going. And then here's book 2. It's very nice Persian miniatures on each one. Each one has its own introduction. And so this is the translation I recommend, and you just have to stay tuned for book 6. So I said there were 2 books where you could start as a kind of companion to Rumi. This is the first one, and the other one is this beautiful volume, which I also highly recommend. And if you can afford it, if it's in your budget, I mean, I don't think these books are extremely expensive, but that's a subjective thing. It varies from person to person, and people's budgets are different. But if you can afford to get both, I would get both of these books. So the second book is Rumi, Past, Present, East, and West. Rumi, Past and Present, East and West by Franklin Lewis. Franklin Lewis. And as the subtitle says, this is the Life, Teachings, and Poetry of Jalal al Dn Rumi. It's a really thick book. It's not counting the footnotes and maps and so forth, and index, 643 pages of text with, a fair amount of maybe 20 pages or so of foreword and preface written in numbered with Roman numerals, about 20, 30 odd pages. Franklin D. Lewis was a very great scholar of Persian literature. He taught at the University of Chicago. I believe he is recently deceased, relatively recently deceased. This was his life's work. He was a great scholar of Persian literature, and his thesis on the genesis and emergence of the ghazal is in the works of Hakim Sanai is still read by people to this day. It's a very important thesis I don't know why it was never published, but it circulates. So this is really comprehensive. This not only looks at the history of and biography and historical details related to Jalal al Dn Rumi, but also the Rumi phenomenon and how it emerged in the West, and who were the great scholars of Rumi throughout the centuries, including in places like Turkey, India, Iran. I mean, if you read Turkish, there's some really great stuff on Rumi in Turkish by a Shia scholar by the name of Abdülbaki Gülpınarlı. That Lewis gets wrong. He, for some reason, says that Gülpınarlı was a Shi'i. It's not true. I mean, I didn't know the man personally, but I know people who did, and I've been to his grave in Istanbul, and he's buried in the Shia cemetery. Anyway, doesn't matter. So, this is an excellent work, and also from a biographical point of view, there's a lot of important details on the life of Rumi. He gives chronology, timelines, and he has a lot to say, well, about everything related to the life of Jalal al Dn Rumi. So just to give you an idea, the Masnavi was composed by Rumi at the suggestion of his disciple Husamuddin Chalabi. So many of his disciples were reading the works of Fariduddin Attar as well as of Hakim Sana'i, the two great exemplars of Sufi wisdom in Persian poetic form before Rumi. And Husamuddin said, well, could you write something along those lines? And it says that right at that moment, Rumi took out a pen and wrote down the first 18 lines of the opening poem of Book 1, which is extremely famous. And it's known as, typically it's known in English as the Song of the Reed. So to just give you an idea of the beauty of the translation by Mujaddidi, we can just read a bit of that, and it rhymes. It's a rhyming translation. So this is the Song of the Reed on page 4 of Book 1. Now listen to this reed flute's deep lament about the heartache being apart has meant. Since from the reed bed they uprooted me, my songs expressed each human's agony. A breast which separation split in two is what I seek, to share this pain with you. When kept from their true origin, all yearn for union on the day they can return. Amongst the crowd alone I mourn my fate. With good and bad I've learnt to integrate. That we were friends, each one was satisfied, but none sought out my secrets from inside. My deepest secrets in the song I wail, but eyes and ears can't penetrate the veil. Body and soul are joined to form one whole, but no one is allowed to see the soul. It's fire, not just hot air, the reed flutes cry. If you don't have this fire, then you should die. Now that's an interesting thing to say. It's an allusion to a famous saying ascribed both to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi and Ali bin Abi Talib alayhi salam that says, Mutu qabl an tamutu, die before you die. And in another saying, again, ascribed to both great figures of Islam, the Prophet and Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, is the saying, An-nasu niyamun wa idha matu intabahu. Humanity or human beings are asleep. When they die, they wake up. So this is the ultimate concern of Sufism. It is the journey back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is alluded to, this spiritual quest is really the essence of the message of the Quran. In the Quran, Allah says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Meaning, and indeed he has attained the supreme success who has purified it. In other words, the soul. And he indeed has utterly failed who has defiled it, namely, again, the soul. In a famous hadith which occurs in both Sunni and Shia sources, it's a long story, but basically the angel Gabriel alayhi salam comes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi in human form and asks him a bunch of questions. And one of the questions that he asks him is, what is excellence. In other words, what is excellence in worship? Mal ihsan. And the Prophet says, Al ihsan an ta'budullaha ka'annaka tarahu fa in lam takun tarahu fa innahu yaraka. Ihsan, or excellence in worship, is to worship Allah as though you see Him, and if you do not see Him, then know that He sees you. This is the essence of Sufism. And contained within that Arabic wording is فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ, and if you are unable, فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ, and if you are unable to see Him, then know that He sees you. But in the Arabic, if you just focus on that, and it says فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ, and you can translate that portion alone, if you cease to be تَرَاهُ, then you will see Him. In other words, it is about the elimination of the self and the subjugation of the baser self and the ego. So that is really the essence of Sufism. And it is said, because Rumi is known as Maulana, our master, and he's also known as Mawlawi, again deriving from the same from the same root. And so his poetic composition, the Masnavi, is known as the Masnavi of Maulana, or the Masnavi Mawlavi. And so there's a verse about it that says Masnavi Mawlavi Mawnavi Quran has Quran dar Zaban Pahlavi. In other words, that this poetic composition of the doublets of meaning is tantamount to the Quran in the Pahlavi, or the Persian language. So this is how the poem opens, and Rumi worked on it for many decades, for many years, and this opening song sort of opens the book, and then throughout there are various stories and parables that teach some lesson or another. And that's how the book is structured, and all of them have some relation or another to the spiritual path, and indeed you can find influences and parallels there of the Quran as well. So Rumi was extremely widely read in the Persianate world. He's a very important person in Afghanistan. When we talk about the Persianate world, it was very important in the Ottoman Empire, very important in India, Pakistan, wherever Persianate culture went, and it continues to be quite important. There's some other interesting sort of things in Franklin Lewis's book, which I would like to just talk about. But before I do that, so I was talking about Rumi's most important writing. So there's the Masnavi. That's in Persian. There is an introduction, though, in Arabic, in which he says that this book is the roots of the roots of the roots of the Deen. So it's the essence of the Islamic religion. He has a number of discourses known as called Fihi Ma Fihi, which simply means in it what is in it. I suppose in more modern American English you could just call the book It Is What It Is. And these are discourses. They were translated into English by A.J. Arbery many years ago. The book, I don't know if it's still published or in circulation. I used to have a copy, but I gave it to a friend. And of course, his very large poetic composition of some tens of thousands, I think it's about almost maybe 30,000, just under maybe 30,000 verses. That's the Diwan Shamsin Tab. And in other words, it's his other kind of poetry in the ghazal form, lyrical poetry. And every ode is, basically the whole thing is dedicated to his teacher, his master Shams from Tabriz. And in fact, sometimes he signs off with each poem with the name Shams. He's so much identified himself. And finally, there are some other discourses of his. It's called the seven assemblies, Majalis Saba. Those are probably his most important works. So Franklin Lewis talks about the influence. You have to understand that Rumi existed at a time when there was a huge efflorescence of Sufism. So we'll just read from page 285 of Lewis's book under the heading Influential Thinkers in Rumi's Neighborhood. I think this is quite fascinating. In addition to men and women of state, Rumi must have met with other religious figures in Konya. As we have seen, Sipah Salar, he is a scholar of Rumi, claims that Rumi met a number of well-known mystics in Damascus, including the Kubravi Sufi Sa'ad ad-Din Hamuya, who died in 1252, and the gifted poet Ohad ad-Din al-Kirmani, who died 1238, whom Ibn Arabi, the great Ibn Arabi, and I'm going to do a video on him as well, a reading list on him as well. Ibn Arabi quoted in his Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, Rumi and Sadruddin Qunawi, the stepson and closest disciple of Ibn Arabi, lived in Konya at the same time. Aflaki describes several encounters between them in which Sadruddin tends to appear as a social or spiritual inferior to Rumi, praising Rumi as the greater sheikh and guide, and indeed the greatest Sufi since Junaid and Bayezid. Sadruddin had been born in Malatya, but came to Konya in 1254, where he prospered and eventually became Shaykh al-Islam, which would explain why Jami in his Nafhat al-Uns describes Rumi following Sadruddin in prayer. It's a well-known incident, and showing him great respect. Whatever their relative social positions, we may infer that Rumi and Sadruddin had met more than once. So Sadruddin Qunawi is the stepson of Ibn Arabi, and we know that he helped to spread his doctrines and to popularize the school of Ibn Arabi. So here he posits that the influence of the school of Ibn Arabi on Rumi has long been assumed. As we have seen, Shamsin Tabriz conversed with a Sheikh Muhammad. So there is some indication that Shamsin Tabriz had met somebody by the name of Sheikh Muhammad, and that was probably, according to Franklin, Ibn Arabi. As Ibn Arabi's actual given name was Muhammad. And he came away much impressed, though ultimately he distrusted Ibn Arabi's spiritual claims and blamed him for not adhering to the example of the Prophet. I'm really not sure what that means. I really don't know what that means. But I'm just reading what Franklin has written here. Franklin Lewis has written here. Ibn Arabi stayed for a while in Konya, but Sipah Salar and an early commentator on the Masnavi, one Kamaluddin Khawarizmi, assert that Rumi met Ibn Arabi in Damascus. This is entirely possible, as Ibn Arabi resided there between 1239 and his death in 1241, during the time frame Rumi studied there. Rumi does recount the attractions of Damascus in one of his poems, in one of his lyric poems, which alludes to various physical features of the city, but in short, he doesn't mention Ibn Arabi anywhere, but it's possible. Rumi and Ibn Arabi seem to have certain assumptions in common, according to Franklin Lewis, including the unity of being, wahdatul wujud, a notion generally attributed to Ibn Arabi and sometimes described in Western works as a kind of pantheistic monism. It is not, but again, we're reading from Franklin Lewis. Likewise, the two would seem to share a belief in the existence of an imaginal world, alam al-khayal, of thoughts and forms. Of course, such ideas may well have been part of the wider zeitgeist among mystically minded Muslims, and Rumi may have imbibed them from a number of other sources. However, the great Shaykh Ibn Arabi's reputation as the fount for all such strains of thought in Islam, the fact that he expounded his theophany more systematically than Rumi, the fact that Rumi was apparently in contact with Ibn Arabi and or some of his close disciples, and the fact that most of the major Masnavi commentators of the pre-modern period approached Rumi's book informed by the assumption of Ibn Arabi's school of thought have created the impression that Ibn Arabi was an important influence on Rumi. Nicholson ventured the opinion in Rumi, Poet and Mystic, that was published in 1950, that even if later commentators exaggerated the extent, Rumi did borrow, and I quote from Nicholson, some part of his terminology and ideas from his elder contemporary, end of quote. So a couple of paragraphs down, we may hypothesize that Rumi did not consciously study or borrow from Ibn Arabi, though Rumi may have imbibed some influence from Ibn Arabi indirectly. If so, this merely resonated with beliefs he already held, derived from his own teachers and from the tradition of Fariduddin Attar and Hakim Sana'i. Rumi does not mention Ibn Arabi, nor have any specific quotations from Ibn Arabi's works. Nor have any specific quotations from Ibn Arabi's works been detected in Rumi's writings, though Rumi may have found some of Ibn Arabi's ideas congenial. Like Shamsin Tabriz, he likely faulted the great Shaykh for insufficient commitment to following the example of the Prophet, which Shams al-Rumi considered an essential prerequisite to proper spiritual practice. I'm really not sure what he means by that. I'd have to go back and study all this in more detail. Finally, one other figure, and we'll wrap this up. It is often said that Rumi and Fakhruddin Iraqi were friends. So who's Fakhruddin Iraqi? He's a very important Persian poet who studied with Sadruddin Qunawi, and presented the doctrines of the Fusus al-Hikam, a very important book, the Bezels of Wisdom by Ibn Arabi, in a very different garb, in the sense of speaking about divine love. And he attended classes on this with Sadruddin, and he wrote a very important book called The Divine Flashes, or the Lama'at, which is extremely important in the notion of the school of divine love, or mazhab-e-ishq in the Persian language. So it is often said that Rumi and Fakhruddin Iraqi were friends. The evidence for this is, however, circumstantial and ambiguous. Iraqi lived near Hamadan, but came under the influence of certain Qalandars, wandering Sufis, whereabout he set out for India. In Multan, in present-day Pakistan, he met Bahaddin Zakaria, whom he left for a while, only to return for a 25-year period of discipleship. So eventually Iraqi leaves, and he goes to Anatolia after doing the pilgrimage, and he settles in Konya, where he professed himself a disciple of Sadruddin Qunawi. Having gained the favor of Muinuddin Parvani, etc., Iraqi went to Tukat, etc., etc. So, if Rumi and Iraqi really did enjoy a friendship, neither considered himself to be a disciple of the other. So, all of this is simply to point out that there was quite a constellation of figures that, for a short time, converged at this one place in modern-day Turkey, or Turkey, the city of Konya. And there were some contacts, influences that took place that had very far-reaching ramifications for the history of Islam and Islamic intellectual history and Sufism in later periods. So just to sum up, I recommend, if you don't know Persian, that you get the Javed Mujaddidi translation of the Masnavi. Unfortunately, the Divan Shamsin Tab has not been translated. And that if you can only afford one book on Rumi, get this one, The Sufi Path of Love, or get this one, you can choose. And if you can afford all of them, then that's it. That's my rather short, but I think authoritative, if I may say so, reading list for getting started with Rumi. And who knows, maybe if you do that, you will become inspired and you will decide to go on and maybe learn Persian, a beautiful language, and then go on to read him in the original. If even one person is inspired to do that, then I will have considered my time in making this video to have been well spent. And in either case, I thank you very much once again for tuning into my channel. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, and share.